For over 1,000 years, one civilization stood as the unparalleled superpower of the ancient world. From a humble village built on 7 hills, it rose to forge an empire that spanned 3 continents, laying the very foundations of Western law, language, and culture. But how did this colossal power emerge from obscurity? What led to its golden age of unparalleled peace and prosperity? And what forces, both internal and external, ultimately led to its dramatic decline and transformation? Join us now as we embark on an epic journey through the rise and fall of Rome, a complete history of the Roman Empire, from republic to decline. Prepare to witness the ambition, innovation, and monumental struggles that define one of humanity's most enduring sagas. Our journey begins on the Italian peninsula in a region known as Latium. Here on the Tiber River, a small settlement would gradually grow into one of the most powerful empires in history. As far back as the 10th century BCE, archaeological evidence indicates that there were early Iron Age settlements on the Palatine Hill. But the 8th and 7th centuries BCE is when things really start happening. We know this because the archaeological record shows an increase in organization. Now, 753 BCE is the traditional date for the founding of Rome. But we don't know if that's accurate or not. It's just a later convention that doesn't necessarily mean anything concrete. But it does mark a period of foundational development. And we see evidence of increased communication, organization, trade, and craft specialization. These communities were located on various hills, including the Palatine, Esquiline, and Quirinal. And they began to unite as one people under the governance of kings, a period known as the Roman monarchy. We have records of 7 kings, though we can't tell how accurate those records are. There are a lot of legends and myths about Rome's legendary founder, Romulus, and his twin brother Remus. But the reality is that most of the early history of Rome is shrouded in myth and legend. What little history there is comes from written accounts like Polybius, his History of Rome, and Livia's History of Rome, as well as archaeology. Unfortunately, the written accounts are often contradictory, unreliable, and nationalist propaganda. So historians tend to rely more on archaeological evidence than written sources. But the archaeological evidence is pretty limited. So what we can say for certain is that there was a centralized authority and that the people were working together on projects like early drainage systems and temples, things that wouldn't have been possible without organization. Most of what we know comes from excavations at the Temple of Portunus and the Forum. Because of the scarcity of records from this time period, historians can only glean so much information from the sources that we do have. The people who lived here were primarily Latin, influenced by the Etruscans to the north. The Etruscans were a highly advanced civilization known for their sophisticated metallurgical skills. Urban planning and religious practices, it left a lasting impact on early Roman culture, influencing its architecture, political organization, and even language. In fact, many scholars believe that the Romans adopted their alphabet directly from the Etruscans. The Etruscans had cities throughout central Italy, such as Tarquinia and Orvieto, which were centers of trade and cultural exchange. They also had burial grounds like the necropolis of Monterazzi, which provides insights into their art and funerary customs. The influence of the Etruscans on early Rome was profound, shaping many aspects of Roman culture and laying the groundwork for Rome's eventual rise to power. As we move towards the end of the 6th century BCE, we begin to see changes that will lead to the overthrow of the monarchy in 509 BCE. The traditional narrative attributes this revolution to the oppression of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, and the subsequent establishment of the Roman Republic. However, the reasons for the fall of the monarchy are complex and multifaceted. Recent scholarship suggests that Rome was experiencing a series of interconnected problems, both real and imagined, that created momentum for change. For example, there was likely a decline in the king's power, possibly due to challenges from within the ruling class or from outside invaders. Also, there was probably growing inequality and social tension, perhaps exacerbated by the influx of refugees from neighboring areas. Finally, there were likely issues related to religion, maybe a loss of faith in the old ways, or pressure to adopt new religious ideas. This combination of factors led to growing dissatisfaction among the populace, especially among the elite class, which eventually culminated in the deposition of Tarquin and the establishment of the Roman Republic. Instead of being ruled by a single monarch, Rome would now be governed by elected magistrates and a council of elders known as the Senate, marking a significant shift in Roman governance. The early republic was not a peaceful one. It was marked by conflict and tension, primarily between the two main social classes, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the aristocratic elite, holding most political and religious offices. Meanwhile, the plebeians made up the majority of the population. They were mostly farmers, artisans, and merchants who had limited rights and representation in government. This disparity led to a series of struggles known as the conflict of the orders, which lasted for several centuries. The plebeians demanded a greater share of political power and social rights. Key events included the secession of the plebs in 494 BCE, when the plebeians briefly withdrew from the city in protest, and the appointment of the tribune of the plebs in the same year. The tribune of the plebs were officials who could veto actions by magistrates that harmed plebeian interests. Another crucial milestone was the codification of Roman law around 450 BCE. The Law of the 12 Tables was a significant step. The laws were inscribed on 12 bronze tablets placed in the Forum. It's the center of Roman public life, making them accessible to all citizens. This was revolutionary because it reduced arbitrary judgments by patrician magistrates and laid the foundation for Roman jurisprudence. Despite these reforms, tensions continued, but the gap between the classes was slowly bridged over time. Meanwhile, Rome wasn't just focused on internal reforms, it was also expanding its influence across the Italian peninsula. However, it's important to understand that this expansion didn't happen all at once. It was not a continuous or unified conquest. Rather, it was a series of conflicts and alliances with neighboring Latin tribes, Samnites, and other Italian peoples. Rome's early encounters were not always successful. They faced defeats at the hands of more powerful neighbors, such as the Etruscans. But they achieved significant victories too, like the defeat of Vigae in 396 BCE. Viola was a prominent Etruscan city. Its defeat was a turning point for Rome, dramatically expanding its territory and influence in Latium, the region surrounding Rome. It also played a role in shifting the balance of power in central Italy. Following this victory, Rome's dominance in the area became more pronounced, setting the stage for further expansion. Other conflicts included the Gallic sack of Rome around 390 BCE, which saw the Roman city sacked by a group of Gauls. This was a traumatic event for Rome, but it demonstrated the city's resilience and determination to rebuild. Despite these challenges, Rome pressed on, continuing to assert itself across the Italian peninsula. Its military played a key role, evolving from a citizen militia to a more organized and effective fighting force. Tactics and strategies were refined based on experience, contributing to Rome's growing success on the battlefield. By 290 BCE, Rome had largely subdued the Samnites after a series of difficult wars. This victory marked a pivotal moment, established Rome as the dominant power in central and southern Italy. This was a considerable achievement, unifying Rome's control over a large portion of the Italian peninsula and setting the stage for further expansion. Rome's expansion across the Italian peninsula did not occur uniformly. Different regions and states were incorporated into the Roman sphere of influence through a combination of diplomacy, conquest, and strategic marriages. For example, in southern Italy, Rome's early contacts with the Greek city-states, such as Syracuse, Tarentum, and Rhegium, were often marked by competition and tension. Conflicts with the Greeks, including the Punic War against Pyrrhus of Epirus, resulted in costly victories for Rome, illustrating the challenges and consequences of expansion. Nevertheless, Rome's persistence paid off, and by 275 BCE, it had consolidated its control over most of the Italian peninsula. In summary, the period from 753 BCE to 264 BCE was a transformative era in Roman history. It witnessed the evolution from a small settlement under a monarchy to the establishment of a republic that dominated central and southern Italy. This journey included the codification of laws, expansion across the Italian peninsula, significant social reforms, and the growth of a sophisticated legal and political system. While much of this early history is shrouded in myth and legend, the accomplishments during this period laid the foundation for Rome's future greatness, setting the stage for its eventual rise to imperial power. The Punic Wars were a series of 3 conflicts fought between Rome and Carthage. Between 264 BCE and 146 BCE, these wars weren't just battles over land or resources. They were clashes between 2 rising powers vying for control of the Mediterranean. What were these wars about? How did they change the course of history? Let's dive in. The First Punic War, lasting from 264 to 241 BCE, was primarily about control of Sicily. Both Rome and Carthage had interests and holdings on the island, and their conflicting views on who should dominate it led to war. At the start, Rome seemed at a disadvantage. Carthage had Rome, a land-based power, had to build a fleet almost from scratch, but they were quick learners. Rome built over 200 ships and developed tactics like the Corvus. A boarding bridge used to turn naval fights into land battles where Roman legionaries excelled. Their years of costly engagements at sea and on land, Rome finally triumphed. Carthage had to give up Sicily and Sardinia to Rome, pay a huge amount of money, and acknowledge Rome's dominance in the Western Mediterranean. This war showed that Rome wasn't just a powerful land force, but could also rule the seas. The Second Punic War from 218 to 201 BCE was much more than a war over territory. It was a clash of military styles and sheer willpower. This war is mostly remembered for the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. His plan to invade Italy and defeat Rome was daring and deadly. Crossing the Alps with his army, including war elephants, Hannibal took on Roman forces in northern Italy. He won big victories at the Ticinus River, the Trebia River, and the Battle of Lake Trasimene. His greatest victory was at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. There he tricked the Romans into a trap, attacking their center and crushing them. Though Rome lost many soldiers, they didn't give up. They adopted a new strategy called the Fabian strategy, named after the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucus. Instead of fighting big battles with Hannibal, they harassed his troops, trying to wear them down. At the same time, Rome focused on winning elsewhere, especially in Spain. There, under the leadership of Publius Cornelius Scipio, who later became famous as Scipio Africanus, Rome slowly pushed Carthage back. Scipio wanted to take the fight to Hannibal in Africa. After getting permission from the Senate, he did just that. In 202 BCE, Scipio and Hannibal faced each other at the Battle of Zama. Scipio won because he was ready for Hannibal's tricks and had studied his battle style. This defeat forced Carthage to give up its lands in Spain to Rome, hand over its entire navy, and pay a huge amount of money. The Third Punic War, the final chapter in the Punic saga, was a lot shorter, lasting from 149 to 146 BCE. By this time, Carthage had paid its debts and followed the rules set by Rome in the last war. But some Romans, especially the senator Cato the Elder, didn't trust the Carthaginians. They thought Carthage was still a threat to Rome, even if it wasn't strong enough to wage another big war. Cato kept pushing the Senate to take action against Carthage, saying that the only way to be safe was to destroy Carthage. Finally, in 149 BCE, the war began. The main event was the Siege of Carthage, which lasted for 3 years. In 146 BCE, the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, captured the city. Carthage was made into a Roman province, and its people were either killed, enslaved, or kicked out. The Punic Wars were more than just battles between two sides. They were a clash of cultures, strategies, and ultimately a fight for control of the Mediterranean. The wars not only made Rome the biggest power in the region, but also shaped its future. While Rome grew immensely powerful, the wars also caused problems within the Republic, especially among the small farmers who had to fight. And the huge wealth gained through the wars made the rich even wealthier, which led to social issues that would eventually lead to the fall of the Republic. So, Rome is a republic, right? Well, by 133 BCE, Rome was arguably the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. But by 27 BCE, it would cease to be a republic. So how did that happen? Well, you can learn more about that through additional resources. So by the late 2nd century BCE, Rome had achieved unprecedented dominance in the Mediterranean. Its total population reached nearly 1 million, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. It was also staggeringly wealthy, with vast amounts of gold and silver flowing into Rome from its provinces. At the same time, Rome's small farmers were struggling. Well, actually, thanks to the efforts of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, we know how much small farmers were struggling because they tried to do something about it. They were part of a group called the Optimates, which were landowning aristocrats, and their goal was to preserve the traditional Roman way of life. Unfortunately for them, due to military expansion, the amount of agricultural land available to them was shrinking. And to make matters worse, newly conquered territories could not be easily incorporated into the economy. Since the people living there didn't speak Latin and often engaged in different forms of agriculture, what this meant was that the amount of land available for small farmers was decreasing, while at the same time, the number of people trying to acquire land was increasing. As a result, land prices shot up, which made things difficult for small farmers who couldn't afford to purchase large estates. Instead, many were forced to work on the lands of larger estates as tenant farmers or slaves. And that wasn't acceptable to this guy, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, who in 133 BCE was a tribune of the plebs, which meant that he was like a representative for the common people. And his goal was to get the Senate to pass legislation that would take land from large estates and give it to poor citizens. That was easier said than done because the Senate was controlled by the Optimates, who, as we mentioned earlier, were generally opposed to any changes that would threaten the traditional Roman way of life. The main argument against Tiberius's plan was that it was unconstitutional. You see, ever since the expulsion of the kings in 509 BCE, Rome had been ruled by a group of elected officials called the Senate. The Senate was not a legislative body, but rather an advisory one. Its members were the most respected and influential citizens, and they advised the magistrates, who were the elected officials who actually made the laws. And so what Tiberius was trying to do was tell the Senate how to do its job, and that was not cool. Well, as you might imagine, the Senate was not thrilled with Tiberius's proposal. And when the time came for him to stand for re-election, they basically blackmailed the other magistrates into voting against him. To make matters worse, Tiberius was trying to bypass the regular process by appealing directly to the people, and that was considered to be crazy talk. The result was that Tiberius was chased through the streets of Rome and murdered by a mob of senators. That might have been the end of it, except that 10 years later, another Gracchus brother, Gaius, tried to push through the same reforms. And this time, the Senate responded by killing him too. The point here is that by the time Julius Caesar came along, the normal mechanisms of government were completely broken. Instead of working within the system to pass legislation, powerful politicians were now free to simply use violence to get what they wanted. And that brings us to the next turning point in Rome's decline, the Marian reforms. Ever since the Roman Republic was founded, its army had been made up of citizen soldiers. This meant that every male citizen had to serve in the military when called upon, and they were required to bring their own weapons and armor. The problem was that as Rome grew richer and its population grew larger, fewer and fewer citizens met the requirements to serve in the army. In response, the Roman people elected a military commander named Gaius Marius, who solved the problem by lowering the property requirements. His reforms allowed for landless men to join the army. The state would then supply them with equipment and pay them a salary. And at the end of their service, they would receive a pension. This meant that instead of being loyal to the Roman state, soldiers were now loyal to their commanders. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, except when those commanders started fighting each other. And that brings us to the rivalry between Gaius Marius and his former subordinate Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In 88 BCE, Sulla was stripped of a military command that he was promised. And so he did something that no Roman general had ever done before. He marched his legions on Rome. When Marius returned from exile, he seized control of the city and executed Sulla's supporters. Sulla, upon learning of this, turned around and marched back to Rome to take it. This civil war proved to be so costly that when it was over, Sulla voluntarily gave up his power and retired. That was probably for the best, because in 78 BCE, Marius died, and with him, died any hope for the Roman Republic. Rome wasn't built in a day, but if you want to understand the fall of the Roman Republic, you really need to know about Caesar. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. By the 60s BCE, the stage was set for a new generation of ambitious figures. There was Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, brilliant general who had just triumphed in the Third Mithridatic War. There was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. And then there was Gaius. Julius Caesar, a charismatic and politically astute figure who was also related to the divine Julius family. Now, these three men weren't related by blood, but they formed what's known as the First Triumvirate, an informal political alliance that allowed them to get around the opposition of the Senate and pursue their own agendas. See, they all had a lot to offer one another. Pompey brought military strength, Crassus brought financial resources, and Caesar brought political skills and connections. Together, they dominated Roman politics for a full decade. And it was Julius Caesar who really benefited from this alliance. In 58 BCE, he was appointed proconsul of the province of Gaul for a 5-year term, but don't let the title fool you. This was a brutal military governorship that would require a great deal of manpower and resources, but Caesar was up for the task. Thanks to his political allies, he was able to raise a massive army and set out on a campaign to conquer the unruly tribes of Transalpine Gaul. Over the next few years, Caesar's legions fought dozens of battles against various Gallic tribes, as well as Germanic and Spanish tribes who had also. And because Caesar was a master of propaganda, he wrote detailed accounts of his victories, which were then published and distributed throughout the Roman world. To say that this made him popular with the Roman public would be a bit of an understatement, but it also made him extremely wealthy. As the conqueror of Gaul, Caesar had seized a tremendous amount of land and treasure for himself and his soldiers, and this gave him the resources to raise a powerful army of his own. In fact, by the time he left Gaul, he had enough influence and manpower to challenge the Senate and its candidate for the consulship. So in 49 BCE, when the Senate ordered him to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, he decided to defy them instead. Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, the legal boundary of his province, and marched his legions into northern Italy. With that, he initiated a civil war against the Republic. He spent the next few years campaigning against Pompey and his allies in Greece, North Africa, and Hispania. And though the fighting was often fierce, Caesar's disciplined legions and his personal charisma proved to be too much for the Republicans to handle. By 47 BCE, Caesar was the master of the Roman world. He returned to Rome and began the process of consolidating his power. Eventually, in 44 BCE, he was appointed dictator for life. Now, this is usually when the story of Caesar turns from Civil War hero to evil villain. We're meant to believe that he became some kind of tyrant who abused his power and oppressed the people. But honestly, there's no evidence for this. Yes, Caesar did enact some reforms, like fixing the calendar and building public works. But he didn't oppress the people or take away their rights. In fact, he was generally beloved by the masses, which is why his own assassination in 44 BCE is such a tragedy. On March 15th of that year, a group of senators, led by Cassius and Brutus, stabbed Caesar to death. They believed they were saving the Republic, but really they just killed off the last vestiges of it. Over the next few years, Rome would be plunged into a final, destructive series of civil wars that would bring the whole system crashing down. And so in the end, Caesar's assassins had the satisfaction of knowing that they killed one of the greatest Roman leaders who ever lived. Following Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, a power vacuum emerged in the Roman world, which was quickly filled by three key figures: Gaius Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir; Mark Antony, Caesar's most prominent general; and Marcus Aurelius Lepidus, another of Caesar's loyal commanders. These three men would formally constitute the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE. Now, you might recall that earlier in Roman history, the term triumvia referred to any group of three men who shared power, but that had changed. Now it was used to describe an official three-man governing body created by the passage of a law called a lex, tria de consumenir, triponetia, potestate. Passed by the Roman Senate in 43 BCE, this law gave the three men the power to appoint magistrates throughout the Roman world. It also allowed them to govern provinces directly, raise armies, and most importantly, gave them command over the legions. This legislation was essentially a brilliant way for the Roman elite to stay in control. During times of crisis, by giving absolute power to 3 men who were loyal to them, but they did not realize how clever Octavian was and how he would use the system to his own advantage. Anyway, the triumvirs' first objective was to consolidate power and avenge Caesar's death. To do so, they implemented a brutal series of proscriptions, similar to Sulla's, executing thousands of their political enemies, including many senators and equities, and confiscated their property to fund their armies. Following this, in 42 BCE, the triumvirs confronted the forces of Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's leading assassins, at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. The battle was indecisive, but it didn't matter because both Brutus and Cassius realized that they were fighting a losing battle and chose to commit suicide rather than face capture. With their immediate enemies eliminated, the trios divided the Roman world among themselves. Octavian controlled the west, including Rome and Italy. Mark Antony took the wealthy east, and Lepidus received Africa. However, this division was temporary. Tensions quickly mounted between Octavian and Antony, whose ambitions and approaches to governance diverged. Moreover, Antony's growing alliance with Cleopatra VII of Egypt and his increasing immersion in Eastern customs was skillfully exploited by Octavian's propaganda in Rome, which portrayed Antony as abandoning Roman values for an Oriental monarchy. The inevitable confrontation occurred in 31 BCE, off the coast of Greece at the Battle of Actium. Octavian's naval forces, commanded by his skilled general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, decisively defeated the combined fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, facing inevitable capture, they both committed suicide the following year. This decisive victory left Octavian as the undisputed master of the Roman world. It marked the end of over a century of civil conflict, but it also signaled the end of the Roman Republic. Following his victory at Actium, Octavian set about consolidating his power and securing his position as the sole ruler of Rome. In 27 BCE, he made a significant move that has become a pivotal moment in Roman history. He formally returned power to the Roman Senate and people, bestowing upon himself the honorific title of Augustus, meaning revered one. This seemingly paradoxical act of abdication and elevation was a masterstroke of Roman statecraft. It allowed Augustus to establish his dominance while maintaining the facade of the Roman Republic. By giving back the power he never really had, he placated the Roman people's deep-seated anti-monarchic sentiments. At the same time, he consolidated power in ways that no one had imagined. Through a combination of shrewd political maneuvering, Augustus gradually secured control over the provinces, the army, and the vital sources of revenue, effectively ending the Republic while preserving its institutions and name. He established a new political system known as the Principate, in which the emperor was officially subordinate to the Senate, but in reality held supreme authority. Under Augustus's rule, Rome entered a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity, known as the Pax Romana, which lasted for over 2 centuries. During his reign, Augustus implemented far-reaching reforms. He reorganized the army, established a professional civil service, improved infrastructure, restored public order, and oversaw a flourishing of arts and literature. His program of public works, known as the Augustan Building Projects, transformed the face of Rome and included the construction of forums, temples, roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. Augustus also played a crucial role in shaping the development of Roman law, laying the foundations for the elaborate legal system that would become a hallmark of Roman civilization. Although Augustus's policies were generally beneficial to Rome, he wasn't above using underhanded tactics when it benefited him. In fact, in 23 BCE, he expanded the voting franchise, granting Roman citizenship to people in certain Italian communities and allowing them to vote in elections. But he only did so to increase the number of people eligible for military service, thereby strengthening his control over the legions. Augustus died in 14 CE after a reign of over 40 years. Having successfully established the Roman Empire and ushered it into an era of peace and prosperity, his ability to maintain the facade of the Roman Republic while concentrating power in his own hands remains a testament to his political acumen. As the first emperor of Rome, he laid the foundations for the imperial system that would shape the ancient world for centuries to come. After the death of Augustus in 14 CE, the Roman Empire entered a period of stability known as the Pax Romana, which lasted for approximately 2 centuries. During this time, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent and enjoyed unprecedented prosperity. The first imperial dynasty, the Julio-Claudians, who ruled from 14 CE to 68 CE, oversaw this transformation. Following Augustus's death, his stepson Tiberius succeeded him. He continued Augustan policies, emphasizing cautious expansion and fiscal responsibility. Caligula, the third emperor, was erratic, and the Julio-Claudians increased imperial extravagance. Claudius, despite his physical infirmities, proved to be an effective administrator and oversaw the Roman conquest of Britannia in 43 CE. The last Julio-Claudian emperor, Nero, began his reign with promise, but it ended in tyranny and financial mismanagement. In 64 CE, the Great Fire of Rome ravaged the city, and 4 years later he committed suicide after a revolt by his own mother and wife. Although the Julio-Claudians were not the most exemplary rulers, they established the framework of the Principate, which ensured the continuity of the Roman state. The abrupt end of Nero's reign triggered the Year of the Four Emperors. In 69 CE, 4 different generals took the imperial throne in quick succession, each claiming legitimacy. This civil war demonstrated that despite the demise of the Republic, the issue of imperial succession remained a potential threat to stability. The conflict ended with Vespasian's victory, marking the beginning of the Flavian dynasty and the start of a new era of stability. The Flavians ruled from 69 CE to 96 CE. Vespasian, a pragmatic and experienced general, restored order to the state's finances, initiated major public works, including the construction of the Colosseum, and reformed the imperial court. His son Titus continued this stable rule. But his reign was marked by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. A major fire in Rome during his rule destroyed much of the city. Domitian, Titus's brother and the last Flavian emperor, ruled increasingly autocratically. He was eventually assassinated in 96 CE. The period between the Flavians and the Antonines witnessed a succession crisis. But it ultimately resulted in the rule of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These emperors were notable for their administrative competence, effective governance, and for generally adopting their successors based on merit rather than solely on bloodline. This practice of selecting competent successors, irrespective of lineage, contributed significantly to imperial stability and effective rule. Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 CE, was the most prominent of the 5 good emperors, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, launching successful military campaigns in Dacia, parts of Parthia and Arabia, Patria. He secured crucial resources, trade routes, and renown as a great conqueror. His successor, Hadrian, adopted a different approach. Instead of expanding the empire, Hadrian focused on consolidating and strengthening Roman rule. He traveled extensively throughout the provinces, personally inspecting and reforming local administrations. One of Hadrian's most enduring projects was the construction of Hadrian's Wall in Britannia, a defensive barrier designed to protect the northern frontier. Hadrian's philosophy of containment contrasted with the expansive ambitions of some of his predecessors and successors. Still, the vastness and diversity of the Roman Empire at this point in history posed both opportunities and challenges. The Pax Romana facilitated the spread of Roman culture. The Latin language and the adoption of Roman customs across the empire. This process contributed to a sense of pan-imperial identity that transcended ethnic and linguistic differences. A series of crises and transformations took place during the 3rd century, commonly known as the crisis of the 3rd century. This era was marked by near-constant political instability, severe economic challenges, and escalating external threats to the empire's frontiers. From 180 CE to 284 CE, over 20 emperors and numerous usurpers came to power, often at the whim of the military. This rapid turnover of rulers significantly weakened central authority and fostered incessant civil wars. As a result, crucial resources and manpower were diverted away from defending the empire's vast borders. Economically, the empire faced a multitude of challenges. Rampant inflation resulted from the debasement of coinage to pay for the ever-increasing costs of the military. Trade routes became less secure due to constant warfare and the empire's economic and military overstretch. Agricultural production declined in many regions, and cities began to shrink as populations faced displacement due to conflicts and economic hardships. Meanwhile, external threats loomed large along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Germanic tribes such as the Goths and Alemanni launched frequent and increasingly large incursions into Roman territory. These incursions placed immense strain on Rome's resources and manpower, further exacerbating the internal crises. Amidst this turmoil, a man named Diocletian rose to power in 284 CE, recognizing the vastness of the empire and the difficulties of effective governance from a single center, initiated a series of radical reforms. His most significant innovation was the establishment of the tetrarchy, or rule of four. The empire was divided into eastern and western halves, each governed by an Augustus, a senior emperor, and a Caesar, a junior emperor and designated successor. While this system initially brought stability and improved administrative efficiency, it also laid the groundwork for the permanent division of the empire. Diocletian also implemented extensive economic reforms, including price edicts aimed at curbing inflation. He reorganized the military and provincial administration, attempting to address the issues of overstretch and defense. The tetrarchy eventually faltered, leading to new power struggles and civil wars. Out of this emerged Constantine the Great, who unified the empire under his sole rule in 324 CE. Constantine's reign marked another pivotal turning point. Notably, his support for Christianity, initially through the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, which granted religious toleration, and later his patronage of the faith. These actions led to the rapid growth of Christianity within the empire, eventually becoming the dominant religion. Constantine also established a new imperial capital in the East, Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, or New Rome, in 330 CE. This strategic location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia would become a thriving metropolis and the enduring capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years after the West's collapse. The process of division became permanent under Emperor Theodosius I. In 380 CE, he made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire, accelerating the decline of traditional Roman paganism. Upon his death in 395 CE, Theodosius formally divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, marking the final administrative separation that would become politically and culturally distinct. Meanwhile, the Western Roman Empire, now weaker and economically less robust than its eastern counterpart, faced intensifying external threats. Germanic tribes, pushed by the expansion of the Huns from Central Asia, migrated en masse across the frontiers. The Visigoths, after sacking Rome in 410 CE under Alaric, a deeply symbolic blow despite the city no longer being the political capital, eventually settled in Gaul and Hispania. The Vandals crossed into North Africa in 429 CE, establishing a powerful kingdom that disrupted vital grain supplies to Italy, and subsequently sacked Rome in 455 CE. The Huns, under their formidable leader Attila, launched devastating incursions into Gaul and Italy in the mid-5th century. Internally, the Western Empire suffered from severe economic and social decay. Trade routes were disrupted, cities declined. Central authorities struggled to collect taxes and maintain order. The population declined due to plagues and warfare. Loyalty to the state eroded as civic virtues were increasingly replaced by local allegiances and a dependence on powerful landholders. The Roman army in the West became increasingly reliant on foederati, or barbarian allied forces whose loyalty was often fleeting. The final symbolic act of the Western Roman Empire's collapse occurred in 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. Although Odoacer did not assume the title of emperor himself, but rather ruled as king of Italy, recognizing the authority of the Eastern emperor, This event is conventionally marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In contrast, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years. Despite its ultimate collapse, the legacy of Rome is profound and enduring. Its advancements in law, administration, engineering, and architecture profoundly shaped subsequent European civilization. Latin evolved into the Romance languages, and Roman legal principles formed the basis of many modern justice systems. The concept of empire, the idea of a universal state, and many aspects of Roman culture continued to influence the societies that arose from its ruins. Thus, the story of Rome's rise and fall remains a timeless epic, a testament to human ambition, achievement, and the relentless march of time. Two emperors saved the Roman Empire. It emerged from the ashes of the devastating crisis of the 3rd century, which saw constant civil wars, an almost collapsed economy, and relentless barbarian incursions. How did it turn the tide? Well, partly due to the god of bling himself, we might say, and partly due to sweeping reforms from the first emperor to defeat a usurper in the Civil War of 284-285 Diocletian. He ruled until 305, ushering in a period of relative peace and prosperity known as Diocletian's stability. But how did he do it? Well, partly by making the empire smaller, not exactly the strategy you'd expect from an ambitious Roman emperor. See, the Roman Empire was just too big to effectively defend, let alone govern. So in 293, Diocletian instituted the so-called tetrarchy, or rule of 4. The empire would be split in two, east and west, and each half would be jointly ruled by an Augustus, a senior emperor, and a Caesar, a junior emperor. Who would you know? Take over when the old guy kicked the bucket or got bored and retired, which actually happened quite a lot in those days. But with 4 guys at the helm, the thinking was that there would always be someone competent running things. Plus, it would free up military resources to defend the frontiers against those pesky barbarians. Now, while the tetrarchy didn't end up preventing the eventual breakup of the empire, it did bring a much-needed period of stability. Thanks to this reform and others enacted by Diocletian, the empire got its fiscal house in order, experienced a population boom, and saw the arts and culture flourish. But the system ultimately collapsed after Diocletian stepped down in 305. The tetrarchy was dependent on the goodwill of the aging Augustus retiring, and the system broke down without that. Power struggles ensued. Empire descended into another round of civil wars, but in the end, one man emerged victorious. You might have heard of him, Constantine the Great. He defeated his rivals decisively at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, outside of Rome in 312. And according to legend, he had a vision that told him to put his faith in the God of the Christians, who in turn helped him win the battle. Whatever the truth of that story, Constantine soon became the most powerful man in the empire, and he wasted no time reshaping it. In 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious toleration throughout the empire. It effectively ended the persecution of Christians and ushered in a new golden age for the church. Over the next few decades, Christianity went from a small, persecuted cult to the most popular religion in the empire. And in 330, Constantine founded the city of Constantinople on the site of the ancient city of Byzantium. It was built on the Bosphorus Strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, controlling the vital trade routes that connected the two. With this move, Constantine was acknowledging the shift in power and wealth from the west to the east, a trend that would only continue in the centuries to come. Officially splitting the empire, however, was left to Theodosius I. In 380, he made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. He then died in 395, leaving his 2 sons, Arcadius and Honorius, to rule the empire jointly. In effect, the division of the empire became permanent. While the emperors in the court would shuttle back and forth between the 2 capitals, the Western Roman Empire based in Rome and the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople. The character of the 2 states was completely different. The West was predominantly Latin-speaking and Catholic, while the East was Greek-speaking and Eastern Orthodox. In fact, many historians argue that these 2 states should be viewed as 2 separate empires. But that's a topic for another video. In 395 CE, the Roman Empire was formally divided into eastern and western halves. And while it might seem natural to view this as a single unit that subsequently fell apart, the truth is that by this point the two entities were increasingly diverging. Yes, there was still a cultural and linguistic unity that bound them together. But as time went on, the Western Roman Empire, with its capital shifting between cities like Milan and Ravenna, faced a unique set of challenges that would eventually lead to its demise. Its economy was generally less robust than the East's, and its frontiers were more exposed to the escalating barbarian pressures. But what exactly were these pressures? To answer that question, let's travel back to the late 4th and 5th centuries. This was a period that witnessed unprecedented waves of barbarian migrations. People like the Goths, Vandals, Suebi, and Alans were on the go. Now, these were not just isolated tribes or small raiding parties. We're talking about entire peoples looking for new lands to call home. And the reason for this massive upheaval can be traced back to the aggressive expansion of the Huns from the Asian steppes. This relentless pressure from the east caused a domino effect, forcing various Germanic and non-Germanic peoples to flee or fight their way westward into the heart of Roman territory. Imagine yourself as a Roman citizen living in the 5th century. Your world is suddenly turned upside down when hordes of people from faraway lands, driven by their own desperate circumstances, arrive at your doorstep seeking refuge and land. For the Romans, particularly in the western provinces, this influx of newcomers was devastating. Not only did it put immense strain on the empire's limited resources and manpower, but it also brought about a level of devastation that shook the foundations of Roman society. The sack of Rome in 410 CE was a pivotal moment in this turbulent journey. The Visigoths, under the leadership of Alaric, had been on a rampage, and their sights were set on the very core of Roman power. Even though Rome was no longer the political capital, having lost that status to Constantinople in the east, it remained the symbolic heart and soul of the empire. To have this city, which had not been touched by foreign enemies for almost 800 years, to see it breached and ransacked was a shock that reverberated throughout the entire Roman world. It raised fundamental questions about Rome's invincibility, about the strength of its armies, and even about the favor of its gods. The sack continued for 3 days, during which the Visigoths pillaged through the city, carrying off treasures and valuables. They left behind a trail of destruction that was hard to ignore. The walls of Rome had stood firm against countless sieges in the past, but this time they had crumbled. Not because of any military tactic, but due to internal strife and the sheer determination of a people who had suffered too much and had little left to lose. This traumatic event sent ripples of fear and uncertainty spreading like wildfire across the remaining Roman territories. Other Germanic groups, witnessing the success of the Visigoths, began to rethink their strategies. They too had suffered under Roman rule, and now they saw an opportunity to carve out their own space in a changing world. The Vandals, for instance, took full advantage of the internal weaknesses plaguing the Western Empire. In 455 CE, they launched a devastating attack on Rome once again. This time the city's walls proved no match for the Vandal onslaught. They looted and burned vast areas of the city, adding insult to injury by setting fire to the very structures that symbolized Roman power. The fall of Rome in 455 was a stark reminder of how far the empire had declined. These external pressures compounded severe internal problems afflicting the Western Empire. Economic decline was pervasive. Trade routes were disrupted. The ability to collect taxes efficiently diminished, weakening the central government. Depopulation in many regions due to plague, warfare, and economic hardship further reduced manpower for both agriculture and the military. The effective authority of the emperors in the West became increasingly tenuous, often relying on the power of strong generals, many of whom were of barbarian descent themselves, to maintain control. So we have a situation where external forces are ravaging the provinces, internal decay is eating away at the core of the empire, and the emperors in the West are struggling to hold on to power. The Roman army, once the backbone of the empire, became increasingly reliant on foederati, a term that encompasses various groups of non-Roman soldiers incorporated into the imperial army. Initially, these barbarian groups provided much-needed manpower to bolster the legions. However, as time went on, Alliances with these groups proved to be more trouble than they were worth. Foederati commanders frequently held more real power than the emperors they nominally served. Over time, this created a complicated web of shifting loyalties and power struggles that undermined the emperor's authority. The traditional Roman civic virtues, the sense of duty, honor, and loyalty to the state, waned as localized allegiances and self-interest took precedence. The final conventional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 C. In that year, the Germanic chieftain, Odoacer, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus is often cited as the definitive moment marking the end of the Western Roman Empire. Romulus, whose reign was brief and largely symbolic, was the puppet emperor, a figurehead with little real power. His deposition by Odoacer, a Germanic general of Pannonian descent, is seen as the last gasp of the empire. Nevertheless, it's essential to understand that this event didn't occur in a vacuum. The Western Empire had effectively ceased to exist decades earlier, by 476. The appointment of Romulus Augustus was more of a formality to maintain the illusion of imperial continuity than a genuine exercise in power. Instead of assuming the imperial title himself, thus becoming the Western, Roman Emperor Octavian chose to send the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, thereby acknowledging him as the sole legitimate emperor while ruling Italy as a king in his own right. From the muddy banks of the Tiber to an empire spanning continents, the story of Rome is an epic unlike any other. Its rise, its golden age, and its eventual transformation continue to shape our world today. A powerful reminder of how civilizations are built, sustained, and ultimately change. If you found this complete history of the Roman Empire insightful, please give this video a like, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Let us know in the comments below which period of Roman history fascinates you the most. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.